In 1995, I was a recent high school graduate, and what I did during my summer vacation was work at the Presbyterian bookstore in Atlanta, Georgia. There used to be one, Presbyterian bookstore. And I was already a church nerd, and I spent most of my salary working at that bookstore using my staff discount on theology books. And I think one of the first books that I purchased was Dr. Cooper White's book, Addressing Violence Against Women and the Church's Response, The Cry of Tamar. In 2004, I was sandwiched between my Master of Divinity program at Union Theological Seminary and my Master of Social Work at Columbia University, and at that time we had a seminary bookstore at Union, and I spent a lot of my money also purchasing theology books, and that is where I picked up Dr. Cooper White's book, Shared Wisdom, on the use of self in pastoral care and counseling. So it feels like I have known her for many years, though I think this is actually the first time we've met in person. Her work is a thread woven into the fabric of my own journey, and so I'm honored to be able to introduce her to you this morning. It's easy enough for you to read the bio included in your registration folder, and I encourage you to do that. But what I find particularly interesting about Dr. Cooper White is the journey that has brought her to this point, her multiplicity, the intersections of her lived experience. Before she was a sought-after professor and speaker in the world of psychology and religion, she was a musician and an activist. She sang full-time with the San Francisco Opera. She advocated for the rights of battered women. She received her first PhD from Harvard in historical musicology. She served as the director of an agency that helped Southeast Asian refugees. As an ordained Episcopal priest, she served her congregations. As a professor, previously at Columbia Theological Seminary in Atlanta and the Lutheran Theological Seminary in Philadelphia, she served her students. As an expert witness, she served victims of clergy sexual abuse. Her clinical chops are broad and deep. Another PhD in clinical social work with a dissertation particularly fascinating to me on countertransference in pastoral counseling and clinical social work. How much do we really want to know about our own countertransference? And she was a Fulbright Fellow studying and teaching at the Sigmund Freud Museum in Vienna, Austria, not too long ago. Dr. Cooper White has won numerous awards, and I'm sorry that we don't have time to list all of them for you all this morning. And Dr. Cooper White has served and continues to serve in leadership in the academy and clinical profession, including the American Academy of Religion, the Society for Pastoral Theology, and the American Association of Pastoral Counselors, one of our co-sponsors for today's event. So as of this morning, so far as I can tell, Dr. Cooper White is the Christiane Brooks Johnson Professor of Psychology and Religion at Union Theological Seminary, following in the esteemed footsteps of Anne Ulanov. She's also a wife and a mother and a grandmother, and still a singer and an artist and a writer. And I think, though I don't know for sure, she is also currently developing a cure for cancer and preparing to compete in the next season of Dancing with the Stars. It just seems like something that you would be doing. So it is with great pleasure and excitement and curiosity that I welcome Dr. Cooper White to the lectern to share her wisdom and her
It's funny you mentioned Dancing with the Stars. My husband, who's the president of the Gettysburg Lutheran Seminary, actually was tapped by the YWCA a few years ago to be one of the celebrities in Dancing with the Local Stars to benefit the YW. And he did a beautiful waltz and a beautiful salsa. He was scared to death. Okay, so, yes, the topic for today couldn't be more timely, and couldn't be in a more relevant geographical location. I recall that PSI's conference on trauma was 2 days after Sandy. So I told the PSI folks, I think next time you ought to just schedule a conference on puppies and kittens. She have this way of predicting things that are rather traumatic for us. So to turn to the serious side of our conversation this morning, I'm going to start with a quote by Julia Kristeva. How could one tolerate a foreigner if one did not know one was a stranger to oneself? And this will be the theme for this talk. The interculturality of our contemporary and so-called globalized world challenges us because it forces us into encounters with the other, the not like me or not like us. It is by now a commonplace that in order to be adequately responsive and sensitive to the interpersonal and social dynamics in intercultural contexts, a process of decentering from our own comfort zone and a stretching to embrace difference must take place. Further, any such work to be effective must take into consideration not only difference per se, but inequality of power. And this has been a theme of my work ever since I started writing about battered women, particularly in terms of entrenched social structures that silently reinforce unearned privilege. A genuine embracing of cultural difference that can break down social inequalities and the dominating use of power requires more than a liberal tolerance or even a sincere but naive form of curiosity about the other. Coming from both a relational psychoanalytic perspective and my work as a pastoral theologian, it is my thesis today that by coming to understand some of the unconscious dynamics at play, both within and among persons, we can build bridges of empathy that can more effectively combat racism, misogyny, oppression, and the exclusion of the other. So this is inner work as well as outer work, which is certainly one of the mission values of PSI. This process will not look the same for those who enjoy categorical privilege vis-a-vis those who do not. But the commitment to meet and understand unwelcome dimensions of our interior life is crucial on both sides of the power divide. Many of us, moreover, live in social locations that are not entirely privileged or entirely oppressed. For example, a white middle-class woman who enjoys race and class privilege but suffers from gender oppression. Or a middle-class woman of color who experiences some class privileges but suffers from both race and gender oppression. Or a gay white man who assumes both gender and race privilege but suffers from the oppression of heterosexism. These examples, because they remain categorical, still do not begin to unpack all the multi-layered dimensions of each individual's social location with its unique confluence of both power and suffering. Nor does categorization of oppressions address the multiple meanings given to these human experiences of marginalization and injustice, both in the crucible of unconscious fantasy and in the relational flux of co-constructed reality. Given such complexity, a conception of the psyche that is fluid, multiple, and relationally constituted is needed to lead us to awareness of our internal inconsistencies and complexity, which can in turn engender authentic empathy for the other. Social work theorist Carolyn Sari has argued for identity complexity as an indicator of mental health. This idea reaches beyond simplistic iterations of identity politics, which tend to frame both identity and also culture, to cite Salah Ben Habib, as fixed and monolithic. Genuine identity complexity also reaches beyond our conscious self-identifications, including our political identities, to the inner domains of our multiply constituted self parts and affect states, many of which are outside our awareness for much or all of the time. From the standpoint of relational psychoanalysis, each of us is internally constituted by a host of internal objects or mental representations which are affect-laden and shaped in the crucible of relationships with significant other persons in our lives from infancy. And this will be very familiar to many of you today. This is my chart of what a kind of general object relational view of the self containing multiple active forces and influences might look like. And of course, we know that it's even more complex than that it's not just good father, bad father, it's tired father, drinking father, absent father, loving father, compassionate father. There's all those fathers and mothers and others. And the arrows on the left there show you the sort of the cycle of projective and introjective processes that go on with later relationships in our lives after these things first get established in infancy and very early childhood. So this should be familiar to most of you. These inner parts are not static or fixed in an Oedipal or even a pre-Oedipal past. Further, unlike the roles of which we may be dimly aware that we may play, for example, in a family or organizational system, these are entirely unconscious until some intervention, either social or therapeutic, allows us to glimpse them by the residue of their effects on our beliefs and relationships, especially because when these effects are not rational or ego-syntonic, they therefore demand some explanation of ourselves to ourselves. These inner parts of ourselves operate mainly at symbolic and nonverbal levels of the psyche, where they're more analogous, really, as Jody Messler-Davies has said, to a kaleidoscopic array of energies. So they're not internal, actual persons. Quoting Gregorio Cohon, objects are not people. Or even, these are partial aspects of our conscious selves, but they're not actual external others, such as good mother, bad mother, or following some therapeutic models, the inner child, or the inner critic, or the firefighter. These are dynamic and fluid. They're never simply replicas of actual people in our past or present life, shaped as they are by internal fantasies and impulses, as well as by social relationships ongoing. So it's my contention that empathy for actual others in our relationships requires us to engage in the work of coming to know, or at least to glimpse, to accept, and even to embrace the parts of our multiple selves that we have found most difficult to acknowledge. Whether through psychoanalysis, psychotherapy, professional consultation, or the rough and tumble of social conflict and everyday relationships, we inevitably find ourselves in situations where parts of ourselves that we denied or suppressed will rise up and act out in ways that surprise us, shock us, even cause pain to ourselves and others. Being willing to explore the more alien parts of ourselves, rather than to seal them over and pretend we are only exactly as we wish ourselves to be, is the beginning of empathic understanding of other persons. So what are the roadblocks to empathy? Two aspects of our inner selves may play an especially important role in creating a bridge to empathy: our vulnerability and our aggression. I thought by now we might need a little bit of a funny picture. You may hear an echo of this in Freud's drive theory, but I'm not really speaking here about libido and the death instinct as discrete motivational energies and urges. Rather, I'm considering vulnerability and aggression as an oscillating pair of affect states that are often, and perhaps even especially, split off from our awareness. We don't necessarily like the lion or the chihuahua inside of ourselves. Speaking from a North American Christian perspective, Anglo-Americans in particular may often find that our societal conditioning makes it difficult for us to be fully conscious of either of these subjective states. Our particular enculturation promotes conscious awareness and adaptation to individuality, personal strength, self-sufficiency, and a can-do attitude that implies an almost sinful quality to weakness or vulnerability. And there's a kind of a parallel trope among black women who have articulated this so well around the strong black woman trope, which makes it very difficult for people to not drive themselves and take care of everybody else at their own expense. Western Christianity, for its part, names overt expressions of aggression as the sin of anger and cloaks subjective aggressive impulses with a mantle of shame. The combination of these cultural myths results in a high level of ambivalence and anxiety about both being vulnerable and being aggressive, since invulnerability moves subjectively toward aggression, at least in the form of self-defense, as Freud first described aggression in terms of self-preservation. And on the other hand, the suppression of aggression tends toward a subjective sense of vulnerability in the form of defenselessness. We don't like either one of those states. Patriarchy further infects these competing cultural and religious narratives of self-sufficiency and non-aggression with gender stereotypes about masculine strength and feminine dependency and weakness, and with prescriptive binary notions about sexual identity and orientation, dominance and passivity. Racism creates a double and triple bind for men and women of color, for whom aggression may be considered to be a positive attribute in some contexts, but a shameful flaw or even a crime in others. This is, of course, just one view from the North American cultural lens. Persons across many cultures and contexts, however, will have their own unconscious motives for repressing, disavowing, or dissociating our awareness of our very human vulnerability and aggression, shaped and textured by their particular social and cultural location and by their unique personal history and intrapsychic makeup. Regardless of the specific ways in which this tension is played out in our individual psyches, these are two affect states that we tend to avoid or unconsciously act out under threat. The other, by definition, is an unknown, and as such may initially trigger an unconscious fear response. Brain science would seem to confirm that we are hardwired to confront the unknown with suspicion for the sake of survival. In a fraction of a second, before any higher rational thought can kick in the prefrontal cortex, part of our ancient brain, the amygdala, is busy throwing up protective barriers. Conceptualizing this in terms of a multiplicity model of the unconscious, the basic affect of fear taps all our prior experiences and our inner parts that carry previous encounters of angst and the related states of both vulnerability and defensive aggression. Psychoanalysis and relational psychoanalysis in particular, as in the work of Jody Messler-Davies and Philip Bromberg, have shown us that we can develop a greater awareness of our inner parts so that we can better predict our autonomic responses in the face of unconsciously perceived threats and learn to soothe, manage, and override our animal reactivity. This will not, paradoxically, be accomplished by pretending to transcend our bodily needs and impulses, our animal sense, because this would plunge us back again into a denial of both vulnerability and aggression, since these are part of our animal inheritance. On the contrary, by embracing our embodied selves in all our complexity, and by befriending the very particular vulnerable and aggressive self-states or parts that we find in ourselves, we are more likely to know and enlist those parts in meeting others who differ from ourselves and stretch beyond our comfort zones. That is, to the extent that we can tolerate feelings of vulnerability, we can modulate our anxiety into appropriate reality testing about the actual level of threat that may or may not exist. To the extent that we can be aware of our own aggression, we can mobilize its energy in the service of building up new relationships, solving associated problems or conflicts, and engaging in the necessary process of learning that can enable greater mutual understanding, rather than using our aggression preemptively to limit or destroy the other. Awareness of our inner multiplicity serves a further purpose, however, beyond a classical ego-psychological framework of reality testing and self-control. As various schools of psychoanalytic thought have proposed across many decades, the more we remove intolerable affect states, memories, impulses, or representations of self or other away from conscious awareness, and there's more than one process for that, right? It's not only repression, it's not only in a self-psychological sense disavowal with the vertical split, but it's also all kinds of dissociative mental processes that remove things from awareness in a multitude of directions. The more we remove these intolerable affect states, the more likely we are to project them onto, or even in the form of projective identification, into the other person who triggers in us an unconscious emotional reaction, driven by one or more of our internal constituent parts or objects. Without at least then some awareness of our internal landscape, our internal population. You know, there's 1,000 people in the room today at least. If we're not aware of this, we will be at a loss to prevent it from happening more or less automatically in the face of an unconsciously perceived threat. We're more likely to project when we're feeling unsafe. We will not only defend against knowledge of our own vulnerability and aggression, but we'll project our vulnerability and aggression onto other people and even into them. The other thus becomes the capital O other, the xenos of xenophobia, the embodiment of strangeness. Because she or he now carries our own fear and aggression, she or he becomes the enemy in and through whom we can innocently fight our own evacuated impotence, rage, and destructiveness as we see it out there. Well, this is actually the unconscious dynamic of paranoia. If you keep yourself completely pure in your own mind, then the evil gets put out there, but now the world is a really unsafe place. And once paranoia is set in motion in the unconscious, it's a short step from fear to hate. What might this look like in an actual experience of diversity that triggers unconscious feelings of vulnerability and aggression? Pinky has road rage. This is a fictional, yet composite case. Pinky, 22-year-old first-year seminarian, slouched in the back row of the mandated anti-racism workshop, arms defensively folded. Pinky had a burly build and muscular arms that offset an innocent face framed by long blonde hair. An only child growing up in a middle-class, mostly white township in upstate New York, Pinky had been her mother's darling as a child and the good girl who usually heeded her father's loving but stringent moral expectations. She was a solid B student and a good athlete, raised religiously in a strict, tight-knit Methodist church community. The nickname Pinky had come from her tendency to blush violently whenever she was teased as a child. She herself had adopted it as a way of making the slur her own and making other kids eat their words, backed up with her fists when necessary. She had discovered the power of her own physical strength in 3rd grade when Ricky McManus, a boy on whom she had a monstrous crush, joined in taunting her one afternoon. Fueled by fantasies of romantic rejection, she felt her humiliation convert suddenly into rage, and she efficiently decked him. She decided the day's suspension from school was worth the newfound respect she enjoyed from shocked classmates. Memories from that afternoon built her self-confidence, which in turn allowed her to safely be her parents' good girl most of the time, but with an emboldened demeanor. Pinky graduated in the middle of her high school class and attended a small liberal arts college in the area. She was pleased when the college chaplain encouraged her to consider ministry. By senior year, she had become a trusted residence hall assistant and peer counselor. Her classmates relied on her air of confidence and compassion. To save money, Pinky's parents decided that she would live with them and commute to seminary. She had high hopes for a future in pastoral care and counseling. Pinky had not been prepared, however, for the culture shock she experienced upon entering seminary. And she didn't even go to Union. The academic demands were much tougher than anything she had known before. The approach to theology was very different from the simple affirmations of faith she was used to at her home church, and the social expectations were even more foreign. The men either shied away from her assertiveness or treated her as one of the boys. The women sometimes found her abrasive and did not seek her out to share confidences as she had experienced in college. She felt like a fish out of water with the assumptions her professors made about historical critical exegesis of the Bible or post-colonial and postmodern approaches in church history and pastoral care. She had never heard of most of what her professors seemed to take for granted, and she wasn't sure she wanted to. Living at home provided a welcome respite at the end of each day, but she knew she was missing out on some of the casual social interactions with other students who lived in the dorm, and she felt cut off from a network of potential support. She felt anxious about what her professors and candidacy committee called formation for ministry. Yeah, like being shot through a mold, she thought to herself. Will I ever recognize myself when I come out the other end? So Pinky sat through the diversity training, longing to be outside tossing a ball or just sitting in the library trying to get a difficult paper over and done with. At times she felt momentary twinges of insecurity, not unlike the way she had felt as a child when she was made fun of before she realized she could defend herself physically. But fists could not help her in this situation, nor could her parents' assurances of how wonderful she would be as a minister. She honestly didn't know how to be good in this situation. She felt unequipped to cope with the strangeness of all the new information being shared in the diversity training. She didn't know how to fend off the feelings of inadequacy, guilt, and shame that threatened to wash over her. In automatic response, she assumed her old familiar stance of bravado and slumped in her seat, looking belligerent and annoyed. She used the evaluation form at the end of the day to vent feelings that the training felt like a waste of her time. Stepping gratefully out into the cold December air, she tried to shake off the day's discomfort and just get home to a hot meal and a comfortable evening on the couch. Driving west with the last streaks of sunset in front of her, Pinky turned on some good loud music. She found herself driving 5, 10, and then 20 miles per hour over the speed limit. Other cars seemed to clog the turnpike, trundling along at an unnecessarily law-abiding pace that started aggravating her until she began weaving among other cars, shifting lanes and muttering under her breath. She felt like cursing and was just about to give one especially slow driver the finger, but remembering her father's disapproval of gutter talk, she held back until the last minute. Instead, she accelerated and cut the guy off. She went hurtling down the left lane, not noticing the road slicking up in the dark. Suddenly, another car shifted in front of her. Slamming on the brakes, she hit a newly forming patch of ice and found herself spinning toward the median. The car revolved 180 degrees, and as she regained control of the steering wheel, she was startled to find herself in the left lane on the opposite side of the turnpike. Thinking fast, with traffic bearing down on her from behind, she accelerated and began to shift lanes to take the next exit and turn around. Just as her breathing began to return to normal, she saw red and blue lights flashing in her rearview mirror. She slammed her fist into the steering wheel, finally letting loose a stream of invectives, and pulled over, praying for the self-control not to scream directly at the cop, who was now fast approaching the driver's side window with a blinding flashlight pointed at her face. So that's Pinky's story. Pinky can be understood as a multiple self. Any single characterization or a clinical diagnosis of Pinky's rage would be simplistic, failing to capture the complexity of her internal conflicting feelings and motivations. A complicated interplay of vulnerability and aggression are at work in this scenario, as Pinky moved through a series of affect states, both familiar and unfamiliar, involving fear of difference, fear of her own complicity in racism, guilt, shame, and in turn, defensive aggression and rage. Pinky's resistance to the training was more than a truculent denial of privilege and an inability to be open to diversity, although it may well have looked like an arrogant refusal to enter into the process of learning. In some sense, it was. Pinky had already been feeling both vulnerable and angry for several months, but the good girl who delighted her mother and kept her father's criticisms at bay had been at the helm of her consciousness most of the time, trying to be the good girl. Many other parts of her, the infant who had learned to adapt to being loved for being the good baby and to split off her own needs and spontaneous aliveness. Some of you will recognize that as Winnicott's false self and true self. The toddler who perhaps felt excited by her parents' hugs and kisses but thwarted by their rules and requirements. The little girl who felt shame and rage while being taunted. The third grader who had learned to use her anger to defend herself. The girl who, under the occasional approving nods of her father, her teachers, and her pastor, the young woman who made pretty good grades but was flummoxed by new academic demands for a level of critical thinking she had never been asked for before, in relation to her faith in particular. The young woman who was used to being everyone's confidant now felt like a social outsider. The young woman who had never thought anything about race or racism in a town that had no people of color that she could recall, and who thought of herself as a good person, but was now being confronted with the possibility that she had enjoyed a race privilege she'd never asked for or subjectively experienced. The frugal commuter student who realized she had not enjoyed many things that some of her wealthier classmates seemed to take for granted. All these parts were roiling in her unconscious. And notice that our unconscious isn't just entirely emotion-laden, but we also have a social and a political unconscious as well, and the ways in which we have been formed in our society's expectations and power dynamics. So this whole experience threw her into a variety of unwelcome affect states from time to time, but she'd never been given the cognitive tools, nor was she in a supportive, safe context to be able to understand her deeper fears and desires or to put them in perspective. So Pinky shoved back feelings of vulnerability, shame, and incapacity that these parts of herself threatened to bring to the surface, and without conscious intention gave in to the seductions of adrenaline that came with pounding music, dangerous speed, and caution-defying expressions of rage. And we can imagine many different scenarios in which vulnerability or aggression or a combination of the two would be implicated in a failure to meet the challenges of diversity and empathic understanding of the other. In Pinky's case, it was aggression that was let loose in the form of rage, like steam escaping a valve. Rage in itself does not lead to insight because it's an autonomic response that boils over, and in fact it defends against deeper and more complex self-understanding. But we could also imagine a scenario in which the affective balance could swing toward an unmetabolized expression of vulnerability. A different person who had never learned or been allowed to use her anger at all might have unconsciously sealed over her aggression. Anger turned inward, she might have sunk into depression, where feelings of vulnerability surface more readily, but without conscious acceptance, turn into rancid despair. It would take courage for Pinky to come to know and accept the more threatening parts of herself, going all the way back to her earliest childhood, and importantly, a relational context would be needed that would help her feel safe enough to risk feeling the feelings that each suppressed part of herself was bearing, in the secret recesses of her psyche. And Pinky is not an extreme example. We all contain parts of ourselves that know things we would rather not know, remember things we would prefer to forget, and represent aspects of our personality that we would rather disavow. These parts carry the emotional freight of such knowledge, memories, and identities or self-states. These are the strangers that live within us every hour or every day. We want to keep them strange, yet as Freud understood, the stranger, the uncanny, is always felt simultaneously as that which we can never know and that which we have always known from our earliest days. The return of the repressed is the uncanny familiar. The stranger outside ourselves who most triggers a fight or flight response is usually the one who taps the most familiar but hidden parts of our internal nature. To quote Julia Kristeva again, "My discontent in living with the other, my strangeness, rests on the perturbed logic that governs this strange bundle of drive and language, of nature and symbol, constituted by the unconscious, always already shaped by the other. It is through unraveling transference, the major dynamics of otherness, of love-hate for the other, of the foreign component of our psyche, that on the basis of the other I become reconciled with my own otherness, foreignness, that I play on it and live by it. Psychoanalysis is then experienced as a journey into the strangeness of the other and of oneself, toward an ethics of respect for the irreconcilable." And this is the quote that ends with this question: how could one tolerate a foreigner if one did not know one was a stranger to oneself? By coming to know and love the strangers within, especially the most vulnerable and aggressive parts of ourselves, we can begin to engage in a kind of internal justice making, whereby the voices we have silenced within ourselves can come to expression. By learning what they bear for us and how they may have helped us to survive across a lifetime of emotional challenges, we can give them new respect and appreciation, even as we may need to parlay conflicting affects and impulses toward a negotiated peace. This kind of inner peace and justice making, which recognizes our unconscious complexity and multiplicity, is what makes us most able to meet the demands of external diversity. I sort of think about bringing all those 1,000 inner parts and affect states and energies together around a table and getting to some kind of a consensus through knowing each other. But that is what is necessary in order for us to come to the table and meet up with others in the external reality. Once we've done that internally, no longer continually threatened by the otherness within ourselves, we can meet and enter into genuine encounters with others in the outer world. Such genuine openness to encounter can in turn lead to an engagement in the kinds of negotiations that true relationship engenders. And not just, nice, kumbaya. And a commitment to justice in which the sacrifice of certain assumptions and privileges can be understood as a larger mutual benefit to both others and ourselves. We can't avoid the reality of our vulnerability. As Judith Butler wrote in the aftermath of September 11th, we are vulnerable. Our lives are always, in her word, precarious. She says this is a condition of being laid bare from the start and with which we cannot argue. It is through mutual mourning and recognition of our human vulnerability and contingency, rather than through denial, that Butler sees the possibility for nonviolence and ethical relating. Recognition is a key concept in relational psychoanalysis. From infancy, our psychic survival depends on truly being seen and known as a cherished other to the mother and other primary caregivers. The parent's non-possessive and non-punitive gaze of recognition, it might be argued, intersubjectively brings the child's infantile psyche into being. Infant observation studies, attachment theory, relational psychoanalysis, and brain science all converge in a postmodern view of such interconnectedness of persons in relation. As Winnicott said, there's no such thing as an infant, there is only a mother and an infant. And this interrelation is not only conscious or interpersonal, but even to a greater extent, an unconscious intersubjectivity between two multiply constituted subjects. As Freud noted early in the history of psychoanalysis, quote, "It is a very remarkable thing that the unconscious of one human being can react upon that of another without passing through the conscious." That's intersubjectivity. Empathy in relational theory, this is my stepson and his little girl. Empathy in relational theory depends upon this human capacity for intersubjectivity and the mutual recognition of parent and baby, friend, lover and lover, enlarges a mutual capacity for fleeting but real moments of I-thou connection. Empathy is not the same as sympathy, which is care and concern for other, but at a distance. Oh, poor you over there. Empathy, and this is my in-laws who are both now departed on their 75th wedding anniversary, and I love this photo of them looking into each other's eyes on their anniversary. Empathy is the impossible but necessary effort to see the world of experience through the other's eyes. It's an impossible but necessary effort. And as well, the capacity to lament one's failures wholly to do so. Empathy in and of itself does not cure racism, colonialism, and oppression, but I believe it's the only human capacity that we have to overcome the processes of objectification that both capacitate and justify those evils. Like Levinas's assertion that the face of the other is a call to responsibility, the empathy born of recognition has a built-in ethical demand to love the other as oneself. An appreciation of our own and others' multiplicity and the dynamics of unconscious intersubjective relationship also have impact for entire communities, even nations and cultures. Freud and his daughter Anna and others in the inner circle, their inner circle, as well as C.G. Jung, all lived through the devastations of war upon war, culminating with the horrors of World War II and the Holocaust. They were therefore no romantics when it came to human nature. In Civilization and Its Discontents, Freud cited numerous savage human atrocities, concluding with Plautus' Homo homini lupus, man is wolf to man. Yet, they believed that their movement was not merely therapeutic for individuals, but had political implications for justice. And Anna, in particular, was very involved with the socialist movements in the 20s in Vienna that were creating kindergartens and polyclinics and humane housing for the poor. The Freuds and their circle and C.G. Jung all envisioned a rising tide of consciousness which augured hope for a less brutal world. As Christopher Lane puts it, what Freud effectively asks could be more political than fantasy, when it determines the fate of entire communities, nations, and even continents. To quote Kristeva again, the ethics of psychoanalysis implies a politics. It would involve a cosmopolitanism of a new sort that, cutting across governments, economies, and markets, might work for a humankind whose solidarity is founded on the consciousness of its unconscious, desiring, destructive, fearful, empty, impossible. Imagine if in this election cycle more of the candidates and their spokespeople had been conscious of the unconscious. Mm-hmm. This is also certainly theological, as we understand the divine as the power of love in relationship. In Kristeva's words once more, henceforth the foreigner is neither a race or a nation. The foreigner is neither glorified as a secret Volksgeist, nor banished as disruptive of rationalist urbanity. Uncanny, foreignness is within us. We are our own foreigners. We are divided. even though it shows a romanticist filiation, such as intimist restoring of the foreigner's good name, undoubtedly bears the biblical tones of a foreign god or a foreigner apt to reveal God. Filipina theologian Elizabeth Dominguez draws on Genesis 1:26 to propose that, quote, to be in the image of God is to be in community. It is not simply a man or a woman who can reflect God, but it is the community in relationship. And as some of you know who've read some of my writings, I also believe that the Trinity in Christianity offers a symbol or image of God as fluid, multiple, and profoundly relational. And by the way, that's also echoed in the Hebrew Bible by one of the names for God, Elohim, which is actually plural. And so it was a council of gods / the gods who created the heavens and the earth. The Trinity offers a symbol of God as fluid, multiple, and profoundly relational. To quote the Catholic feminist theologian Elizabeth Johnson, at its most basic, the symbol of the Trinity evokes a livingness in God, a dynamic coming and going with the world that points to an inner divine circling around in unimaginable relation. God's relatedness to the world in creating, redeeming, and renewing activity suggests that God's own being is somehow similarly differentiated. And this icon, which is of the mysterious visitors under the tree at Mamre to Sarah and Abraham, is an image also of the divine. And what I particularly love about this image is that if you gaze on this icon long enough, you'll discover that in their relatedness, there's a space at this table for you as well. And it is holy food at the center. Feminist theologians have also challenged Enlightenment mind-body dualism as perpetuating the subjugation of women's experience and glorifying disconnected rationality at the expense of the lived experiences of childbirth, sexuality, dying, suffering, and surviving. God is in the body, not disembodied. Feminist theologian Sally McFaig has offered the metaphor of the world itself as God's body. Womanist, that is, Black feminist theology in particular, celebrates the power of sheer survival as a source of knowledge to inform and sustain faith. God is experienced both in the community of solidarity and within the self. As in Ntozake Shange's often quoted line of poetry, I found God in myself and I loved her fiercely. Postmodern or radical Orthodox theologian John Milbank also views the Trinity as a sign of God as community, not just God in community, but God as community, even a community in process, infinitely realized. Milbank finds the expression of this Christianity not in formal creeds and doctrines about God, but in practices of community. If we accept the idea that consciousness is inherently relational and intersubjective, then our theologies in a variety of faith traditions, perhaps not only Christianity, although I can only speak for my own, might be similarly understood intersubjectively. Theology might be framed, hearkening back to St. Augustine, in terms of a mutual, co-constructive, co-generative yearning between humans and the divine. Desire for the other, even God's desire for us and ours for God, reaches across the gaps, the transitional space, to create an intersubjective arena for creation. What binds and heals in a relational model is not an Enlightenment vision of ultimate oneness, either of God or humanity as in a homogenization, but the mutual desire and love of God and human beings that bridges toward each other, embracing difference. A multiple relational theology, it seems to me, is hospitable to an embodied conception of mind and self that gives room enough for human persons to encompass a wide capacity for relationality, opening our capacity, in the words of Micah, to love kindness, to do justice, and to walk humbly, both with our God and with other people, and as well to be more open and generous toward the multiple selves that inhabit our inner lives. Freud's conception of the unconscious as a product of inner conflict and repression perhaps unconsciously reflects the war-torn and ultimately genocidal milieu of his life and times. A turn to multiplicity may bear the marks of the fragmentation and alienation of our own era. I do think it's interesting that multiplicity has been coming up in a number of different disciplines and also within psychology in our time. It may be, in fact, most intuitive for us to first appreciate multiplicity as it operates at the social and political level. For example, Mark Klein Taylor advocates a postmodern shift from dependency on certain truth claims or dominant voices to the nurturing of breadth in conversation that would actively include voices from the margins. Taylor refers to our moments of alienation, disempowerment, and vulnerability at the conscious level of political relations when he writes, exploration of our own otherness is also crucial to the whole breadth of conversation. Now he's speaking interpersonally, and without taking anything away from the call for a preferential option for the voices of the poor and the disenfranchised on the conscious level of political discourse, completely agree with that. I would argue that Taylor's recognition of our own otherness must be implied to our internal otherness as well, and that all political discourse is carried on waves of unconscious as well as conscious communication. So to conclude, the extent to which we can be aware of our inner multiplicity and take seriously the hosts of voices crying from the margins of our own unconscious life may well be the extent to which we are able to recognize and withdraw projections that demonize, dominate, and exclude actual other persons in the context of intercultural spiritual care and our political life. In so doing, we perhaps can even participate in the eternal intersubjective conversation, the I-thou moment that most brightly reveals our shared creation in images and likenesses of God. Thank you.